The morning Margaret died, James made her a promise. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday in October, and the hospice room smelled like antiseptic and the peculiar staleness of recycled hospital air. Margaret's breathing had changed around midnight, shallow, rattling, like someone trying to speak through water. The nurse had told him it would be soon. The nurse had been right. James sat on the edge of the bed holding his wife's hand. Her skin felt like tissue paper stretched over bone. After 53 years of marriage, he knew the landscape of her hands better than his own. The thin scar on her index finger from when she cut herself making Christmas cookies in 1987. The liver spots that had appeared in the last year like a map charting their passage through time together. "Margaret," he said, though she'd been unconscious for hours. "I'm here. I'm right here." Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. Not quite focusing, not quite seeing him. But something in her reached toward him anyway, the way she always had, the way she would have even in sleep. "The pool," she whispered. It took everything she had. Her chest heaved with the effort. "You promised." James felt his throat tighten. 40 years ago, when they'd first moved to Crescent Hills, Margaret had wanted to build a pool in the backyard. It was their dream, a place to cool off on summer nights, to float under the stars, to watch their grandchildren learn to swim. But life had interrupted with its ordinary cruelties. His layoff in 1985, the mortgage crisis in 2008, the endless parade of maintenance emergencies and medical bills. They'd raised their children in that house. They'd buried 2 parents. They'd survived cancer, bankruptcy, infidelity temptation, and the 1,000 small deaths that marriage demanded, and the pool had never happened. "I know," James said. "I know, honey. I know." Margaret's hand gripped his with surprising strength. "Promise me. Promise me you'll build it. When I'm... She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. "I promise," James said. "I promise you, Margaret. I promise." He meant it the way you mean it when you're sitting in a hospice room watching someone you love slip away. He meant it with the part of himself that believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that some promises could still be kept, even after time had said no. Margaret died at 7:13 a.m. The nurse came in and moved through the necessary rituals, checking for a pulse, turning off the monitors, calling the time of death into her phone with professional neutrality. James just sat there holding his wife's cooling hand, watching the light change on her face as the sun moved higher through the hospital window. The pool had been his daughter's idea initially, back in 1983 when houses in Crescent Hills were still a bargain and the neighborhood had character. Crescent Hills had been different then, a community of working people and young families. People who knew their neighbors, who borrowed tools and shared recipes, who gathered in yards on 4th of July and watched their kids run through sprinklers in the dying light. But time and money had gentrified the neighborhood with relentless efficiency. The old Cape Cods got torn down and replaced with McMansions. The modest ranches were flipped and modernized. Property values tripled, then tripled again. The families that had moved in over the last 15 years wore their wealth differently than the original residents, with a kind of aggressive visibility, a need to announce their arrival through renovations and upgrades and an increasingly elaborate set of rules. 5 years ago, Crescent Hills had formally incorporated as a planned community and established a homeowners association. The bylaws were extensive. They covered everything: roof colors, fence heights, landscaping specifications, acceptable lawn chemicals, mailbox designs, and an entire section on swimming pools that James, in his grief fog and determination, had somehow failed to read in detail. It was this failure that would change everything. The funeral was on a Tuesday. 300 people came, more than James expected. Margaret had been a teacher for 40 years. 2nd grade mostly, with a 10-year stretch in kindergarten. Nearly every adult who'd grown up in the Tri-County area seemed to have passed through her classroom. They told their stories in the receiving line. Margaret, who'd caught them when they were falling behind. Margaret, who'd believed in them. Margaret, who'd sat with parents during their own crises, who'd known their names and their struggles and their secret dreams. James listened and nodded and accepted condolences the way you do when you're operating on autopilot. He was 68 years old. He'd retired from teaching high school history 5 years earlier. He and Margaret had been planning this next chapter. Travel, grandchildren, time together at last. Instead, Margaret had begun experiencing headaches. The doctors had found the tumor. 2 years from diagnosis to death, now there was only autopilot. Only the soft whisper of routine and ritual. His son David and daughter-in-law Patricia insisted on staying for a week. David was a lawyer, successful and busy, always consulting his phone between conversations. Patricia was an architect with sharp angles in her face and sharper edges in her opinions. They'd never quite approved of James and Margaret's choice to stay in the old house in the aging neighborhood. They'd suggested multiple times that James sell and move to a senior community, somewhere with built-in social structure, somewhere organized and safe. James had always declined politely. This was where his life was. This was where Margaret was. On the morning David and Patricia left, James stood in the driveway waving goodbye, and something crystallized inside him. A clarity, a purpose, not an escape from grief. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that a pool could salve what had been torn from him, but a way of being with it, a way of turning the promise into something real. He spent the afternoon researching. He sat in Margaret's office. They'd kept it even after she retired. A room lined with photographs and children's artwork and the accumulated detritus of a life spent teaching, and he opened his laptop and began reading about in-ground pools. The mathematics were staggering. A basic 15 by 30 installation could run $30,000 to $50,000 even in a modest market. Excavation, permits, equipment, installation, concrete. James had some savings, careful years of teachers. Pensions and modest spending had accumulated to around $200,000. Margaret's life insurance had added another $150,000. He could afford it. The question was whether he should. He thought about Margaret floating in starlight. He thought about his grandchildren learning to swim. He thought about summer nights sitting on the edge with his feet in the water, remembering what it was like to be young, to believe the future was infinite, to hold his wife's hand without worrying it might disappear. By October 15th, James had selected a contractor, a company called Poolside Perfection out of the city. By October 22nd, he'd chosen the location, the western half of their backyard, where the afternoon sun was best and the mature oak trees provided afternoon shade. By October 29th, he'd hired a surveyor. By November 2nd, the first survey markers appeared in the yard, and James became aware that he had made a serious mistake in not reading the HOA bylaws more carefully. The letter arrived on November 4th, delivered by hand. James didn't know her name yet. That was the thing that struck him later, when the whole business had become something else entirely, when the conflict had metastasized from simple neighbor dispute to something darker. He didn't know her name when she knocked on his door at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning, somehow already furious, already bristling with the kind of righteous indignation that seemed to wake her up angry. She was perhaps 50, blonde hair pulled into an aggressive ponytail, wearing white jeans and a pink cashmere sweater despite it being November. She had the kind of face that had been worked on by professionals, not badly, but noticeably. There was a permanent tightness around her eyes that suggested either chronic anxiety or chronic Botox. Probably both. "I'm Sheila Hartman," she said, not waiting to be invited in. "I'm the president of the HOA Architectural Committee." James stepped back instinctively. "Hello? You can't build a pool?" she said. "I've read through your permit request. It violates Code 4.7.2, subsection B, which clearly states that any water feature in excess of 400 square feet requires unanimous approval from the Neighborhood Review Board. Not majority approval, unanimous." James had actually read Code 4.7.2 by now. He'd also read the companion section about appeals processes and grandfather clauses. "Our house predates the HOA incorporation," James said carefully, "by 22 years. I believe that technically nothing," Sheila interrupted. "The rules apply to all properties. Every property. That's what makes them rules. What makes them a community." She said community the way someone else might say prison, as a place where individual desires were subordinated to collective order. Besides, a pool will destroy the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. This is a prestigious community, James wanted to say. It's a neighborhood. The people here are what makes it prestigious, or not aesthetic codes. But he was grieving, and therefore magnanimous, or perhaps just tired. Instead, he said, "My wife passed away recently." This was something she wanted. "I'm going to build it." Sheila's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "Condolences," she said, with no inflection whatsoever. "But that doesn't change the rules. You'll be hearing from the HOA legal team if you proceed. The fines start at $500 per day of non-compliance." She too. "Let me make some calls," David said. "But Dad, this could get ugly. These people, they take this stuff seriously. And they have lawyers." James had a lawyer too, he almost said. He had a wife who'd believed in him. He had 53 years of kept promises and love that had survived every trial that mattered. He had nothing to lose now except the world's approval, which had never been worth much anyway. "Let it be ugly," James said. "I'm building the pool." The first excavation began on November 15th at 7 a.m. James had paid a premium to get the work started quickly. He'd also paid a premium to hire extra security. 2 large men in reflective vests who stood at the edge of the property with very clear instructions about not letting anyone interfere with the equipment. He was not naive. He'd already received 2 more letters from the HOA, each one more legal and threatening than the last. The excavator was enormous, a yellow machine with a bucket the size of a refrigerator. It growled and lurched forward, and the first bucket of soil came up from the ground. 50 years of his life in this backyard, all those Saturday mornings mulching and watering and tending the garden where Margaret had grown tomatoes and herbs. All of it was going into this pool. He stood on the back patio with a thermos of coffee watching the work begin. The morning was cold and clear. The sky was a particular shade of November blue. Not quite winter yet, but the knowledge of winter already written into it. By mid-morning, he'd attracted an audience. His neighbors came out to watch from their yards. Some waved. Some stood silently. He recognized Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down. She'd been a colleague of Margaret's, had taught right alongside her for nearly 30 years. She smiled at him and made a thumbs-up gesture. He felt tears prickle his eyes. It was around 10 a.m. when the first police car arrived. Officer Martinez was professional and apologetic. She explained that they'd received a complaint about noise violations and work being conducted before permitted hours. James showed her the contract. The work had started at a permitted time. The neighbors had no legitimate noise complaint. Officer Martinez seemed to sympathize, but rules were rules. "Is someone going to keep calling?" James asked her. Officer Martinez chose her words carefully. "There are people who are very invested in order, in maintaining certain standards. They have time and resources to pursue these things. You should know that going in." After she left, the excavation continued. By evening, most of the area had been dug. The hole was enormous, 30 feet long, 15 feet wide, 6 feet deep at its deepest point. Looking at it, James felt the enormity of what he was doing. There was no turning back now. The damage was done. The only way forward was to finish. That night, his phone rang. It was a lawyer, the HOA's lawyer. His name was Burton Vale, and his voice suggested he'd learned to be threatening through tone and phrasing alone, without needing to actually threaten anything explicitly. "Mr. Chen, the Architectural Committee has formally rejected your pool installation as non-compliant with Code 4.7.2. Work must cease immediately. Any further violations will result in legal action and daily fines of $500. My name is James Park, not Chen," James said. "And I'm not stopping." There was a pause. He could hear the lawyers breathing on the other end. "That's unwise," Burton Vale said. "The HOA can place a lien on your property. We can pursue foreclosure proceedings if necessary." "Over a pool?" James asked. "Over violating the clear rules of your community," the lawyer said. "Rules that exist to protect property values and maintain standards. This isn't personal, Mr. Park. It's about principle." After the call ended, James sat in the darkening kitchen and thought about principle. He thought about Margaret, who had spent 40 years in classrooms with children from struggling families, who'd bought school supplies out of her own pocket, who'd believed that everyone deserved a chance to become who they wanted to be. He thought about what it meant to have principles and what it meant to abandon them in the face of pressure. He walked back to the window and looked out at the excavation pit, this enormous hole that was half promise and half destruction. Tomorrow they'd begin installing the framework. Tomorrow the real work would begin, and James would not stop. He would not stop for lawyers or fines or the creeping desperation of people so invested in order that they'd forgotten what it meant to live. He would not stop for the rules or the regulations or the architectural committees. He would build this pool if it cost him everything, because Margaret had asked him to, and his wife had never asked him for much. And he had too many empty years left to fill with anything but keeping his promises to the dead. Outside, the November wind picked up, and somewhere in the neighborhood, a woman sat in her pristine kitchen checking HOA bylaws on her phone, her jaw set with the determination of someone who'd decided that battle lines needed to be drawn. She had no idea what was about to be unleashed. She thought this was about a pool. She thought this was about rules. She was wrong about everything. By mid-November, the pool construction had become the most contested real estate in Crescent Hills. The foundation was being poured on November 18th, when Sheila Hartman returned with a clipboard and the expression of someone who'd been delegated the authority to ruin people's mornings. She was accompanied this time by an older man in golf attire, presumably one of the review board members, and a woman with a camera. The woman with the camera was busy photographing everything. The equipment, the half-dug infrastructure, the measurements marked out on the concrete. James watched from the patio, his thermos of coffee cooling in his hands. "You're documenting the violations," Sheila announced to James, not bothering with pleasantries. "For the legal record." "That's fine," James said. Document away. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He simply didn't have it in him anymore to perform the small courtesies that people expected. His wife was dead. He was building her a pool. Everything else seemed approximately equally irrelevant. "The review board convenes on November 20th, the older man said. His name tag read, Howard Price, Vice President. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who'd drawn the short straw at an HOA meeting and been assigned the task of delivering bad news in person. "We'll be formally voting on action to cease work and impose fines." "You can do what you want," James said. "I'm building the pool." "You'll regret this," Sheila said flatly. "You have no idea what you're up against." She was wrong, but not in the way she meant. James did have an idea what he was up against. He was up against his own mortality, against the knowledge that time was finite and promises were sacred and that most people never got a second chance to keep them. He was up against the desperation of grief, which was sometimes indistinguishable from clarity. What he didn't know was how far this would go, how much energy and spite and vindictiveness could be mobilized in defense of rules, and order and the suburban mythology of community. Standards, he would find out soon enough. The HOA review board met on November 20th, and the results were exactly what James had expected. A formal cease and desist order, effective immediately. A $500 daily fine beginning on November 21st. A directive to provide a written explanation for the violations within 14 days. A threat of legal action and property liens if the work continued. The letter was delivered by courier, which seemed excessive and deliberately theatrical in a way that James found almost sad. Sheila was spending so much energy on this. She must have been very unhappy. David called that evening, his voice tight with stress. "Dad, you need to stop now. They're serious about the legal action. I can fight them, but it's going to be expensive and they have resources. They'll just keep appealing and prolonging and how much to continue the work?" James interrupted. "Dad, how much would it cost you to keep pursuing this if I refuse to stop? Because I need to know what I'm asking you for." There was a long silence. Then David said quietly, "A lot. Probably $10,000 to $15,000 before we're done. Maybe more if it goes to actual litigation." "I have the money," James said. "I want you to take it. I want you to fight them." "Dad, that's not the point. The point is they can make this incredibly painful. They can drag it out. They can..." I know, James said. I'm asking you to help me do it anyway. He heard his son exhale slowly. The sound of someone wrestling with whether love meant honoring his father's wishes or protecting him from his own impulses. The sound of impossible choices. Let me look into it, David said finally. But Dad? Be careful. You don't know these people. You don't know what they're capable of. What Sheila Hartman was capable of turned out to be quite extensive. On November 21st, she filed a formal complaint with the County Planning Commission. On November 22nd, a second complaint was filed by Howard Price claiming that the pool installation violated state environmental codes regarding groundwater disruption. On November 23rd, a third complaint came from someone James had never met, claiming that the construction was causing damage to neighboring properties through vibration and dust. By November 26th, James had received 6 separate notices from various county offices, all of them requesting documentation, explanations, and proof of permits. It was a coordinated campaign. It was hostile. It was, James suspected, technically harassment, but harassment that was just legal enough to maintain plausible deniability. The construction crew was growing nervous. James's contractor, a man named Derek, who'd been nothing but professional and reliable until this point, came to him on the morning of November 27th with worry etched across his face. Mr. Park, I'm not sure we should continue, Derek said. The fines and now all these complaints. I've got a business to protect. I've got employees. If this turns into litigation and gets tied up in courts, it could affect my license, my reputation. I can't keep going, James understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. I'll hire a new crew, James said. I'll pay a premium and I'll hire new crew. You did nothing wrong. You did everything right. This isn't your fight, but finding a new crew proved to be harder than he'd anticipated. Word had gotten around. Other contractors, perhaps warned by poolside perfection or perhaps just exercising caution, declined to take on the job. The few that would consider it quoted astronomical prices, $30,000, just for the labor to finish the concrete work that Derek's crew had begun. James paid it. He was spending money at a rate that alarmed even him. The pool itself had spiraled into the $80,000 range with all the complications. The legal fees were adding up. The fines were accumulating at $500 per day, which meant that by the beginning of December, he owed $15,000 in fines alone. His son's legal fees were approaching $12,000. The new contractor's premium charges had added another $30,000. He was burning through his savings at an unsustainable rate, and he didn't care. Or rather, he cared in an abstract way, like recognizing that a ship was sinking while you were already underwater. There was no point in worrying about finances when the real problem was that his wife was dead, and the world was determined to make that fact even worse by preventing him from keeping the one promise he'd made to her in her final hours. On December 4th, his daughter Emily came home. Emily lived in Boston and worked in publishing. She'd only stayed 2 days for the funeral and had expressed limited interest in the family drama surrounding the pool until she'd seen the latest news. A full-page story in the neighborhood community. Newsletter titled HOA and Homeowner Battle Over Controversial Pool Installation. The article was written by someone with a clear bias against James. It mentioned the violation of codes. It mentioned the fines. It mentioned the aesthetic concerns of the neighborhood. It did not mention Margaret's death or James's age or the fact that he'd been a teacher in the community for 35 years. It was the story told from a particular angle, and that angle made James seem unreasonable at best and malicious at worst. Emily had read it, gotten angry, and booked a flight home. She arrived on a Friday evening and spent Saturday morning walking the property with her father, understanding for the first time the full scale of what he was doing. The concrete was poured. The filtration system was being installed. The tile work would begin in a week. They were 3 weeks away from completion. "This is insane," Emily said, but she said it with affection, not judgment. She was Margaret's daughter. She had her mother's capacity to understand that some things mattered more than practical sense. "You're spending a fortune." "You're getting sued. Why?" James showed her the photo. He kept it in his pocket now, a picture from their 50th wedding anniversary. Margaret in a cream-colored dress, smiling at the camera like she believed in the future. Like she believed there was still time. She asked me, James said simply. Right before she died, she asked me to build it. Emily looked at the photo for a long time. She would have loved this, she said finally. All of it. Not the fighting, but the stubbornness, the refusal to let someone else's rules matter more than what she believed in. She would have loved that about you. Would have? James asked gently. Emily smiled sadly. Still would. Still does. Whatever. Time gets weird after someone dies. She spent the rest of the day making phone calls. By evening, she'd contacted several local media outlets. By Monday, she'd given interviews to 3 different journalists. By Wednesday, there was a story in the regional newspaper. Grieving widower defies HOA to build pool in wife's memory. The story included Margaret's photograph. It included quotes from Emily about her mother's character and her father's devotion. It included James's teaching record and the community impact he'd had. It included quotes from Mrs. Chen and 3 other neighbors who spoke about the original character of the community and the way it had changed. It included the financial information about the fines and the legal costs, framed in a way that made the HOA's escalation seem vindictive rather than principled. And it included a quote from Derek's crew about the quality of the installation and James's integrity as a client. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sheila Hartman didn't expect the community to turn against her. This was perhaps her greatest miscalculation. She had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years. She'd served on the HOA board for 3. She'd successfully pushed through architectural improvements that had, in her estimation, elevated the neighborhood's prestige. But she'd also driven out 3 families who couldn't afford the special assessments. She'd fined the Johnsons for their hedge being 6 inches taller than code allowed. She'd made enemies of people who'd already been here, already belonged before she'd arrived, and now, faced with James Park, an elderly man building a pool in memory of his deceased wife, supported by a narrative that positioned the HOA as the villain, she discovered that institutional authority without community support was basically a costume with nothing inside. Letters began arriving at the HOA office. Emails, angry, calls to the board members' personal phones. A petition, started by Mrs. Chen and Emily, demanding a reconsideration of the complaint and a lifting of the fines. The petition gathered over 200 signatures from neighbors, and more kept coming. A local councilwoman saw the story and requested that the HOA board members attend a community meeting to discuss whether the fines should be suspended pending legal resolution. The board meeting was contentious. Howard Price, who'd seemed sympathetic but ultimately aligned with Sheila, suddenly discovered that he had concerns about the process. Other board members shifted. The legal counsel, Burton Vale, informed them that while they had technically been within their authority to levy the fines, continuing to do so in the face of this community response might open them to allegations of harassment or abuse of process. In other words, backing down was now legally advisable. On December 15th, the HOA issued a statement saying that the fines would be suspended pending review. The cease and desist order would be modified to allow completion of the pool, provided that James submit to a final inspection to ensure safety compliance. It was a surrender dressed in bureaucratic language. The pool was finished on December 28th. James had paid for a final detail-oriented walkthrough with the contractor. Every tile checked, every seal inspected, the water chemistry tested and retested. Everything perfect. The water itself was a blue so pure and clear it looked unreal, like someone had poured sky into the concrete shell. James stood at the edge on a cold December morning and felt something in his chest break open. Not painfully, but the way a bud breaks open into a flower. All the grief and anger and determination crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. This was real. This was done. This was his promise, made manifest. Emily took his photo standing at the pool's edge, and he was smiling in that particular way that bereaved people sometimes smile when they've done what they set out to do, and it hasn't actually made them happy, but has somehow made them less sad. She would have loved this, Emily repeated, echoing her earlier words. I know, James said. He thought about Margaret floating in the water on a summer night. He thought about their grandchildren learning to swim. He thought about all the moments that would happen in this space going forward. All the future that he wouldn't be alive to see, but that would exist because of this choice he'd made. And he thought about Sheila Hartman, who'd tried to stop him and had failed. But not because he'd been stronger, he hadn't been. She'd been stronger in a way. She had the system. She had the rules. She had the authority. But what she'd lacked was the thing that Margaret had given him, a reason to keep going that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with keeping faith. On December 29th, James turned on the pool circulation system for the first time. The water moved. The chemicals balanced themselves according to the precise settings he'd programmed in. The tile gleamed. He walked back inside and sat in Margaret's office and looked at her photograph and said, "Done. I kept my promise." The office didn't answer back. But in the silence, James heard everything. All the words Margaret would have said, all the approval and love and validation that constituted the real infrastructure of his life. Not the pool, the love. Everything else had just been the expression of it. That evening, Sheila Hartman sent an email to the HOA board resignation letter, effective immediately. She didn't provide a reason. She didn't need to. In the new year, the neighborhood would find a new president for the architectural committee. Things would quiet down. The pool would become just another feature of the landscape, unremarkable and common. But for now, in the last days of December, it was something else. It was a monument to what happened when someone chose love over rules, promise over comfort, memory over the easy surrender to what the world demanded. It was, in other words, everything Margaret would have wanted. The HOA emergency board meeting on January 7th was contentious from the moment Howard Price called it to order. Sheila was no longer present. Her resignation had been swift and final, and she'd made it clear through her lawyer that she considered the matter closed. But her absence didn't mean the issue was resolved. If anything, it had metastasized into something more complicated, a question about process, about authority, about what happened to institutions when they were perceived to have acted unjustly. The meeting room was in the Crescent Hills Community Center, a building that had been built in the 1990s and maintained with the kind of aggressive mediocrity that suggested the HOA's priorities lay elsewhere: fluorescent lights, folding chairs, the smell of old carpet and institutional coffee. James didn't expect to be invited to the meeting, but Emily had ensured his attendance through sheer force of will. She'd called the president of the board and informed him that her father had a right to speak on matters affecting his property and his community standing. The board members seemed uncomfortable with James's presence. Howard Price, who'd previously seemed like a decent person caught between conflicting pressures, now looked like someone who'd been caught committing a minor crime and was afraid it might become a major one. "Let's address the core issue," one of the other board members, a woman named Patricia Velasco, said. She was a banker, James thought, or had been. She had that careful, precise way of speaking that suggested she'd learned to extract emotion from language and replace it with careful risk assessment. "The fines that were levied have been suspended. The cease and desist has been modified. We've achieved a resolution. The question is whether there are additional measures the board feels are necessary." "I think we should formally apologize," Patricia said. Patricia was not the same Patricia as James's daughter-in-law. This Patricia had previously served as the HOA treasurer and had, according to Emily's research, voted against the initial fine and had abstained from the legal action. "Apologize to whom?" asked a man named Frank. He was a realtor, and he'd been the strongest voice in favor of continuing the enforcement. "The pool violates our codes. It always violated our codes. The only reason we backed down is because of media pressure and because some people in the community decided emotion trumps rules." "The rules are there for a reason," Frank continued. He was speaking quickly, a man sensing his authority slipping away. "They maintain property values. They maintain standards. If we just capitulate every time someone has a sad story, the codes become meaningless." "Your concern," Emily said from where she was sitting in the back. is that we might end up with a neighborhood where people's individual desires matter more than arbitrary codes created by committees that serve no democratic function. Frank looked at her irritably. "Who are you?" "I'm his daughter," Emily gestured to James. "And I'd point out that arbitrary codes were preventing my father from installing a safety feature that increases property values, provides recreational utility, and creates no hazard to anyone. The codes were a problem, not the pool. The codes are—" Frank started. "Arbitrary," Emily interrupted. "You're about to tell me they exist to maintain community standards. Community standards are what the community decides, not what a subset of the community decides and then enforces through threat. You had the authority but not the legitimacy. There's a difference. Howard Price had clearly had enough. He called for a vote on 3 measures. 1, formally lifting the fines and suspension period. 2, amending Code 4.7.2 to grandfather properties built before the code's implementation date. And 3, issuing a formal apology to James and Margaret's family for the distress caused. The vote was 4-1, with only Frank dissenting. James would receive a check for the $15,000 in fines. The cease and desist would be formally withdrawn. A letter of apology would be sent. It wasn't a victory. Victory implied that there was an enemy to defeat, and James had never thought of the board in those terms. They were people following rules they believed in. The tragedy was just that they'd believed in rules more than they believed in people. And that was a mistake nearly everyone made at some point. After the vote, Howard Price approached James. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," Howard said. "I should have stood up earlier. Should have pushed back against Sheila. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because it was easier than resisting." James shook his hand. "You came around," he said. "That's not nothing. A lot of people don't." The letter arrived 2 days later. It was on official HOA letterhead, signed by Howard Price as president. It expressed regret for the distress caused, acknowledged the legitimacy of James's project, and extended the community's sympathies regarding Margaret's death. James read it and felt very little. The apology was nice in the way that apologies usually are, a way of acknowledging wrongdoing without truly addressing the harm. But the harm wasn't really the fines or the legal fees, though those were real. The harm was deeper, rooted in the way that institutions so often prioritized order over compassion, rules over the actual lives of actual people. He didn't blame Howard for that. He blamed no one in particular, which meant he blamed everyone collectively, which meant he blamed no one at all. Blame required a belief that things could have been different, and maybe they couldn't have. Maybe this was just what happened when grief met institutional bureaucracy, a collision that left damage in its wake. What mattered now was that the pool was done. The first real use came on January 15th. It was unseasonably warm, the kind of winter day that felt borrowed from a warmer season. The sun was high and bright, and the temperature had climbed into the low 50s, not warm enough to really swim, but warm enough that James decided to fill the pool. The rest of the way, Derek's crew had left it partially filled and let it sit. His grandchildren were visiting. David and Patricia had brought them for a long weekend. James's grandson Marcus was 8, old enough to remember Margaret, but young enough that his memories were already becoming soft and impressionistic. His granddaughter Sophie was 5, too young to remember her grandmother at all, but smart enough to understand that her grandfather was sad about something. "Is this the pool Grandma wanted?" Sophie asked, standing on the concrete edge, looking down into the blue water. "It is," James said. "We're building it for her. Can she use it?" Sophie asked. James paused, working out how to explain death to a 5-year-old, or perhaps explaining it to himself through a 5-year-old. "In a way," he said finally, "when we're in the pool, we'll be thinking about her. We'll remember her, and that's how she'll be here." Sophie seemed to accept this. She sat down carefully on the edge and put her feet in the water. "It's cold," she said. "It will warm up," James assured her. "By summer it'll be perfect, but they wouldn't be there by summer." David and Patricia lived in the city now. David's firm had promoted him, and he was working 80-hour weeks. Patricia's architecture practice was taking off. They visited occasionally, but the geographic center of their lives was increasingly distant from James's. That was fine. That was what happened. Children grew up and moved away and built their own lives. Margaret had understood that. She'd never tried to hold on too tightly, never demanded constant contact, or made him feel guilty for his own adult independence. "Can I tell you something?" James said to Sophie as they sat with their feet in the water. Sophie nodded solemnly. She had Margaret's eyes, that particular quality of stillness and attention that suggested she was actually listening, actually present. "Your grandmother was very special," James said. "She loved people. She loved learning. She loved this house and this neighborhood and the pool that we're building. But more than anything, she loved your dad, and your dad loves you. And that's how love works. It passes down." "It moves through families, like a river?" Sophie asked. "Exactly like a river," James said. "It starts somewhere and it flows through time and it touches everything it encounters." He thought about Margaret teaching second grade for 40 years, pouring herself into children who would grow up and pour themselves into their own children and their own communities. He thought about the ripple effect of a life well lived, extending forward into time in ways you could never fully track or measure. That evening, James stood at the pool's edge and threw in a handful of Margaret's ashes. He'd saved some, just a portion, the part that seemed most essential to her. Her doctor had given him a folder of instructions and information, but James had mostly just carried the small wooden urn through the months of grief and conflict and construction. Tonight, standing with his son and his grandchildren, it felt right to release some of it, to let Margaret return to the element she'd wanted to rest in, to complete the circle. David put his arm around his father's shoulder, and they stood together in silence as the ashes dispersed through the water, creating small gray clouds that dissipated into blue. "She would have loved this," David said quietly. "I know," James replied. It was what everyone kept saying, and by now it had the quality of an incantation, a repeated prayer that was true and insufficiently true at the same time. Margaret would have loved it, but Margaret would also have loved just sitting on the porch with James on a Sunday afternoon. She would have loved a cup of tea and a good book. She would have loved teaching. She would have loved being alive. The pool was a beautiful thing, but it wasn't a substitute for the person it was meant to honor. It was just a reminder, a place where memory could gather and grief could be witnessed, and love could be expressed across the boundary between life and death. By February, the story had mostly faded from the news cycle. There was a brief follow-up in the community newsletter, a positive piece about the pool as a community asset, written by someone with a clearly different perspective than the original article. There was no mention of Sheila Hartman, who'd moved on to other neighborhoods and other HOAs, presumably to continue her mission of maintaining order against the chaos of individual human need. James didn't think about her much anymore. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the promise. He thought about what it meant to refuse to back down, not because you were right, but because you were committed. Because you understood that some things mattered more than comfort or ease, or the approval of authority. The pool water moved with the circulation system. The chemicals stayed balanced. The tiles remained clean. In a few months, he'd be able to actually swim in it, to float in the blue under the summer sky, to remember his wife and the life they'd built and the future that had been taken from them both. He'd keep the promise. He'd already proven that. Now he just had to learn to live with what came after. The loneliness, the emptiness, the understanding that some losses never truly close. They just become part of the landscape of your life. Like a pool in a backyard, like a memorial in concrete and water, like love itself expressed through the only language that grief could speak. James looked at the pool one evening as the sun was setting, and he saw Margaret's face reflected in the water. He knew it wasn't really there, knew it was just the light hitting the surface at a particular angle. But for a moment he let himself believe that she was there, was looking back at him from the other side of death, was telling him that yes, it had been worth it. Yes, the promise had mattered. Yes, this was what love looked like when it refused to end. Even after everything had. The water rippled, and the reflection dissolved. And James turned to go inside. Tomorrow he'd call the pool company to schedule the first professional maintenance. Tomorrow he'd update the landscaping around the installation. Tomorrow he'd begin the work of living in the aftermath of completion. But tonight, he just let himself remember. Margaret wanting. James promising, death taking her anyway. Grief refusing to be silent or reasonable. A pool built in defiance of rules and order, and the world's demand that he accept his loss quietly. A pool built because one person loved another person more than he loved peace. That was the real story. Everything else was just details. By March, Sheila Hartman had accomplished something remarkable. She'd systematized her approach to neighborhood management. She'd taken a position as a paid HOA consultant for 3 different planned communities. She'd joined the board of a regional HOA advocacy group. She'd written an article for an industry publication titled, Maintaining Community Standards in the Face of Emotional Appeals. A legal and practical framework. The article never mentioned James Park by name. It didn't need to. Readers understood that she was writing about cases like his, situations where individuals attempted to circumvent established codes through appeals to sentiment, tragedy, or special circumstances. The greatest threat to community governance, Sheila had written, is the erosion of standards through incremental exceptions. Once you allow one deviation, you've created precedent for all deviations. The moment an HOA board prioritizes emotional narratives over established rules, the board has effectively acknowledged that rules are optional. The article got picked up by industry blogs. Other HOAs cited it. Sheila was invited to speak at a regional conference, and no one who read her work knew that she'd been wrong. No one knew about the community that had turned against her. No one knew about the media story that had made her look unreasonable. No one knew that she'd resigned in shame and then methodically rebuilt her professional identity around the very principles that the community had rejected. Sheila had learned a critical lesson. If you lose the narrative battle, you leave and find communities where you can control the narrative, where rules matter more than people, where efficiency mattered more than compassion. And unfortunately, such communities existed in abundance. But that was all far away from Crescent Hills, far away from James, far away from the pool that was now functioning smoothly in a backyard in a neighborhood that had, collectively, decided it didn't care as much as it thought it did. What James didn't know was that his victory, such as it was, had come at a cost that extended far beyond his savings account. The HOA meeting had fractured something in the board's cohesion. The 2 new members that replaced the retiring ones in March seemed to have a fundamentally different understanding of what community governance meant. But so did Howard Price, after his experience with the James Park situation. He'd spent 3 decades following HOA bylaws, believing in the system, trusting that rules created order. And then he'd been forced to confront the possibility that rules could also create cruelty. That realization had broken something in him too. By April, new problems were emerging. The Johnsons, who'd been fined 2 years earlier for their hedge being 6 inches too tall, sued for the return of their fines. The lawsuit was small, only $400, but it opened the door. Within weeks, 3 other families had filed similar claims. The old couple, who'd been assessed $15,000 for replacing their roof with a shade, not on the approved color palette, demanded the return of their money. A woman who'd paid $1,000 to have her fence removed because it was deemed out of code requested recompense. The board found itself suddenly facing dozens of retroactive claims from people who'd previously accepted the fines as inevitable. The cost of living in the community. Now those people were asking themselves, if the park could ignore the board's authority and win, why should we remain compliant? The cascade was small but persistent. Each claim was individually relatively modest, but collectively, they represented a threat to the HOA's financial structure and authority. At the May board meeting, a new motion was introduced, a blanket review and potential elimination of all fines and fees levied over the past 3 years. The board member who introduced it was Patricia Velasco, the banker. "We have a liability issue," she explained. "Every fine represents a potential legal challenge. We're looking at tens of thousands of dollars in retroactive exposure if people decide to pursue it. We can either spend the money fighting individual lawsuits, or we can make a strategic decision to reset. Clear the slate. Acknowledge that our enforcement has been inconsistent and potentially excessive. That's letting people win through litigation threats, Frank protested. He was the realtor, the one who'd voted against the apology. We establish precedent that the board can be bullied into surrendering authority through legal action. Or we establish precedent that the board is reasonable and willing to correct overzealous enforcement, Patricia countered. Either way, we're establishing precedent. The question is which precedent we prefer. The vote was 4-1. Only Frank voted against the slate review. By the end of May, every resident who'd paid fines to the HOA in the past 3 years had been issued a refund. The refunds totaled approximately $87,000. This is what James didn't understand, and what he wouldn't learn until much later, that the true cost of institutional overreach isn't borne by the individual who resists. The true cost is absorbed by the institution itself, which must eventually account for its own excess. The HOA couldn't fire Sheila. She'd resigned. It couldn't unmake the authority it had delegated to her. It could only absorb the damage and move forward, humbled and diminished. What happened over the following year was a quiet reformation. The architectural committee was scaled back. The code enforcement became less aggressive. The board began meeting with residents, actually listening, rather than just issuing directives. They hired a professional management company that brought a more measured, less ideologically driven approach to governance. Crescent Hills remained a planned community. The rules remained in place, but the spirit in which they were enforced had fundamentally changed. It was late August when James received a phone call from Howard Price. "I wanted to check in," Howard said. "See how you were doing. And to tell you about some changes." James listened as Howard explained the policy shift. The refunds, the structural changes, the move toward a more collaborative approach to governance. "You did that," Howard said when he finished. "By refusing to capitulate, you forced us to reckon with what we were doing. You changed the institution." James wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd been trying to build a pool, not reform an HOA. He'd been trying to keep a promise to a dead woman, not serve as a catalyst for systemic change. "I didn't do anything," James said finally. "I just kept going." "That's what doing it means," Howard replied. "You kept going. You forced us to confront ourselves. We didn't like what we saw, so we changed. That's how change works. It's not usually dramatic. It's just people deciding to do better." After the call ended, James sat in Margaret's office and thought about systems and individuals, about how individual refusal could reverberate through institutions in ways that were often invisible until long after the fact. He thought about Sheila, who'd learned nothing and had simply carried her approach forward into new communities. And he thought about Howard, who'd learned everything and had spent the rest of his year as HOA president trying to undo the damage. There were no villains in this story, James realized. There were just people, making choices, trying to navigate systems that were larger than their good intentions. The pool continued to function perfectly. By November, it was an ordinary thing. James had used the pool dozens of times. His grandchildren had swum in it every visit. The community had gradually stopped noticing it. It had become just part of the landscape, like the oaks that had been there for 100 years, like the houses that lined the streets. In late November, as the weather began to turn, James decided to close the pool for winter. The contractor came and winterized the system, draining the pipes, shutting down the circulation, covering the water with a protective tarp. James watched the process and felt a strange kind of completion. The pool had been a project, and projects had phases. This was the closing phase. Come spring, he'd reopen it. Come summer, his grandchildren would swim. The cycle would continue. Margaret's 1-year death anniversary fell on a Thursday, October 15th. James had planned nothing specific, no ceremony or memorial. What would be the point? The pool was the memorial. Everything he did going forward was the memorial, but Emily insisted on visiting. She came for 3 days, and they spent the time walking through the house, looking at photographs, remembering stories that had become worn smooth by repetition, but were still worth repeating. She was happy, Emily said, looking at a picture of Margaret in her classroom, surrounded by second graders. Even at the end, I think she was happy about what she'd done, about the life she'd lived. She was happy when she died? James asked gently. No, that's not what I mean. She'd completed something. She knew she'd mattered. That's happiness. Or at least, it's a kind of satisfaction that comes close to happiness. James looked at the photograph and tried to see into it, to locate the satisfaction Emily was describing. What he saw was a woman in her element, surrounded by children who were looking at her with that particular kind of attention that children gave to adults they trusted. Not reverence exactly. Just trust. Just the belief that this person could be believed in. That was the life Margaret had built. That was the thing she'd done that mattered. The pool was just the after effect. The echo. One afternoon in early December, James got a surprise visitor. The man who knocked on his door was in his 30s, wearing a suit and holding a casserole dish. Behind him was a woman about the same age, and behind her was a child, maybe 7 years old. "Mr. Park?" the man said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm David Winters. I was in your wife's second-grade class. I don't know if you'd remember me." James did remember him, actually. David Winters had been a shy child, struggled with reading, had responded to Margaret's patient persistence with a kind of tentative blooming. By the end of the year, he'd been reading at grade level. He'd gone on to be successful. James had heard through the grapevine over the years that David had gotten a college degree, had become an engineer, was doing well. "Of course I remember," James said. "Come in." David's wife, Sarah, had also been in Margaret's class, though several years later. They'd met in college and had no idea of the connection until they started dating and realized they'd both had the same teacher. They'd gotten married, had a child, and now they were moving into the neighborhood. They'd seen the story about the pool and realized the connection. "Your wife changed my life," David said, sitting in the living room. "I was going to be shuffled into special education. My parents were ready to accept it. My old teacher had suggested it. But Margaret believed I was fine. She just believed in me. And I was fine. I just needed someone to believe in me." Sarah nodded. She was like that with every kid. She noticed things other teachers missed. She saw potential. James found himself crying a little bit, which surprised him. He thought he'd cried enough about Margaret, had processed the grief enough that these stories would be comforting rather than destabilizing. But comfort was a destabilizing thing sometimes. It forced you to confront the magnitude of what had been lost. It forced you to recognize that a single person could matter so much, could touch so many lives, could send ripples forward into time that would continue long after she was gone. "I wanted you to know," David said, "that her impact was real, that what she did mattered. I know that doesn't help the grief, but I wanted you to know." After they left, they'd insisted on leaving the casserole despite James's protests. James sat in the kitchen and thought about legacy. Margaret's legacy wasn't the pool. It was in the lives of hundreds of people she'd taught. It was in the way David had raised his own children to believe in themselves. It was in the teachers that her students had become, the parents who remembered her kindness and tried to extend it to their own children. The pool was just the most visible expression of James's love for her. But her actual monument was something far more profound and far less tangible. It was the collective impact of a life spent believing in people. That winter, James made a decision. The pool had caused enough conflict, had generated enough drama, had been enough about him and his personal relationship to Margaret. He decided that he wanted it to mean something to the community. He wanted it to stop being a point of contention and become a point of connection. In January, he approached Howard Price with a proposal. He would donate the pool to the HOA. The board would assume ownership and maintenance responsibility. In exchange, James would establish a scholarship fund in Margaret's name, using part of his remaining savings to provide awards to local students pursuing careers in education. The board accepted immediately. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain from accepting donated infrastructure. They had the community goodwill generated by supporting a scholarship in the name of a beloved teacher. But more importantly, James had found a way to transform the pool from a monument to personal grief into a community asset. The pool would still exist. People would still swim in it. It would still represent what he'd done for Margaret. But now it would also represent something forward-looking, something generative, something that multiplied the original gift. By February, the Margaret Park Memorial Scholarship Fund had been established. With an initial donation of $50,000, the board voted to name the community pool in Margaret's honor. A plaque was installed beside the entrance with Margaret's photograph and a quote from one of her students. "She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The pool became a regular gathering place. Swim lessons were held in the summer. Children's birthday parties, adult lap swimming in the mornings. By summer, it seemed like the neighborhood couldn't imagine not having a pool, like it had always been there. Like it was a natural feature of the landscape. James watched people use it and felt something settle in his chest. Completion. Purpose. The sense that the promise had been kept not just to Margaret but to the future. That the act of remembering her had created space for others to make their own memories, to find their own joy, to live their own lives more fully. One evening in July, James was sitting on a bench beside the pool when a small figure climbed up next to him. It was Sophie, his granddaughter, now 6 years old. She'd spent the afternoon at swim lessons and was chlorinated and tired and happy. "Grandpa," she said, in the particular way that children have of broaching important topics, "is Grandma in the pool?" James thought about how to answer this. The literal answer was no. Margaret was wherever the dead went, wherever that was or wasn't. The spiritual answer was yes, in the sense that places could carry the presence of the people they were created for. The practical answer was yes, in the sense that Margaret had shaped everyone who used this pool through the example of her life. "In a way," James said finally, "when you swim here and you think about her, she's here. That's how people live on after they die, through memory and through the things they built and through the people they touched." Sophie considered this seriously. "That's nice," she said.